All right, hello everybody, and welcome to our first Hill Spotlight. I'm Brendan Cooley, this is John Buckleiter. We're serving as editors of the Hill this year. We'll be sitting down each month with a professor or visiting lecturer on campus and talking to them about both their academic work and current events going on in North Carolina, around the United States, and around the world. This month we have with us Professor Emeritus of History, Dr. Richard Kohn. Professor Kohn is an expert in U.S. military history, particularly civil military relations. He served on the faculties of numerous universities and war colleges, and he was the chief of Air Force history during the 1980s. He came to UNC in 1991 and chaired the curriculum in Peace, War, and Defense until 2006. And he recently gave a talk at UNC entitled 6 Myths About Civil Military Relations in the United States. He's graciously agreed to join us today to discuss these myths and other topics. Professor Kohn, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So we'll get back to a few questions on your recent lecture in a little bit, but I wanted to start with a few questions elsewhere. In a 2009 article, Professor, entitled "Tarnished Brass, Is the U.S. Military Profession in Decline?" you argued that the military is plagued by intellectual, political, and moral and ethical deficiencies. Could you briefly summarize your argument in that article and tell us whether you believe that these trends hold today, 4 years after you wrote that?
Yes, well, first I didn't say they were plagued. I said they suffered some, and I, at the end of that article, pointed out that this was by no means a crisis of military culture, somewhat similar to what we experienced near the end in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. But what I pointed out was that with the size and scope and responsibilities of these interlocked institutions and the quality of the people that they have in them, they had not been very effective at formulating strategies to win the United States' military interventions, beginning with the Vietnam War. They had not served in their advisory capacity very well to the civilians. And it was basically in the strategic thinking that I thought that they had the greatest deficiencies. Their operational and tactical proficiency, I said, was extraordinary, and that's one of the reasons it kind of hid the strategic. The political, I pointed out over the last 30 or 40 years, the United States military has become much more political and much more politicized. The officer corps has become more partisan. Trend began in the 1990s of senior retired people endorsing presidential candidates, which was something new and which was really an intervention in politics, particularly the way it was done at the very beginning in 1992. That officers, and this was often pointed out during the 1990s, expressed their dislike of Bill Clinton, and before that of Democratic presidents. They often spoke out on issues of policy, both active duty and particularly retired senior flag officers, which complicates the advisory and responsibility and duty of serving senior officers. And even some of the enlisted people, the senior enlisted people, were known to mouth off occasionally, inappropriately, on political issues or issues that affected politics. And the moral or ethical, I pointed out, were just a continuing problems of proper professional behavior that the military itself agreed were egregious. It didn't seem to be able to suppress this. The most obvious example, of course, is of sexual harassment and explosion over tail hook. But there were other ethical lapses, a lack of accountability and responsibility for deficiencies, like the Pat Tillman case, in which the famous football player was killed by his own fire, but given a Silver Star for the action, and it was suppressed that he had been killed by friendly fire in his own unit, and the way in which the family was treated. But this is only an example of these things. The more recent ones, you had Marines urinating on dead corpses and then filming it, which of course was terrible behavior and of course dysfunctional for trying to win or at least suppress the insurgency in Afghanistan, Abu Ghraib in Iraq. And these other kinds of things just continually crop up. Recently, several senior officers in the last year have had to be retired under less than gracious circumstances for violating the rules, take advantage of their position. So that was the basic argument, and these things do continue, although I think there's been a renewed effort on the part of the senior leadership to try to deal with the strategic deficiencies and to try to teach the force to be less political and try to get the senior officers to stop fooling around in politics. Although there was a recent incident in which a friend of mine, I might add a Duke PhD in military history, retired Major General Bob Scales, wrote an article about the Syria policy and about the dismay of the military with the Obama administration, which was utterly improper, and the arguments were unhelpful to the relationship between military and civilian. And he's been taken to task for it, rightly so. Very thoughtful man, a former commandant of the Army War College. And the ethical things are a real problem that are always going to be there. I hate to say this, it may sound flip of me, but you take young people who have high hormonal activity, and you put them together in intimate circumstances, and then you say, no fooling around, but people do fool around, and it's a very strict and disciplined force, but it happens. And it's not been dealt with adequately, and one of the most, I think, less persuasive hearings was when all the senior people lined up in front of the Congress and said, yes, we have problems, but we want to keep this problem in the purview of the commanders to deal with. It wasn't very credible, and it still is up for grabs. It's being considered by the Congress.
Okay, so as you mentioned, this kind of lack of strategic planning or deficiency in strategic thinking that you referenced, particularly while waging two wars. Now that we've ended one and are winding down another, what direction do you think U.S. military strategic thinking should go?
Well, there's plenty of strategic planning, don't mistake me, and that's really wise, but I don't think that the armed forces, even though they're trying much harder than the last 5 years or so to develop strategists and a more robust and more sophisticated strategic thinking about the future and about how to deal with any inherently unpredictable military situation, because that's what they are. Mm-hmm. I think the problem is complicated by the need of the services to justify their budgets and to justify their weapons systems. They are charged with having to prepare for an uncertain future of all kinds of possibilities of warfare. Recently, in the last few years, they've been actually charged in policy documents that they have to plan for insurgencies and wars amongst people, as well as conventional and nuclear war and all the other sorts of wars. Just at a point where I think the American people have said, we're not going to engage in long, indecisive wars again of this kind unless there's really an absolute need for it. So I think what they have to do, in my judgment, is recognize that they are likely to get into situations that are both precedented and surprising, if you can understand that tension. Very little new happens in the world. But they have to be able to adapt their force to whatever they are called upon to do. And I think that they really need to take a very strong look at their force structure and the kinds of weapons they buy, and whether those are appropriate to the threats that they can see, let us say, 10 years or 20 years out. And so it's not a question of as much knowing how to deal with a warfare situation as it is whether they can adapt, and whether, and this is most important of all, they are producing, educating, and training their officers to be able to first figure out the situation they are in, and second of all, how to adapt military force to what the objectives, goals, and policies are of the United States and their civilian leaders. And that requires a certain independence of thinking, and I've argued in print and in some consulting I've done with the Department of Defense that what that really requires is a different set of personnel policies in both the professional military education realm and in how we develop officers in their assignments to produce this kind of officer. It might also require a different or a renewed effort to recruit the finest young people in our country to try, at least, to consider military careers. And it calls for a loosening of the rigidity, if you will, about the prescribed military career patterns. Issues like, can my spouse find employment if I'm going to be shifted every 2 or 3 years and moved all over the country? And what is my family life going to be like if I have to deploy overseas every 3 years? These are problems for the active duty, but also for the reserves, for the National Guard and the reserves.
Okay, yeah.
So back to your lecture last week. You highlighted the ability of the Department of Defense to play off of the executive branch in Congress, something you refer to as, and pardon my actual French, the ménage à trois.
À trois.
À trois.
You know what that is, of course. That's the
Marriage of three.
Well, yes, that's right. It's
Directly translate.
Not the proper relationship
Yes, yes.
of two people in a marriage.
So can you go into a little bit more detail about what you mean by that, and draw a few instances of how this plays out in reality?
Yes, well, you know that one of the myths of civilian control is that the president is in charge, the president's the commander-in-chief, and the military does what he says. And the truth is that under the Constitution, the Congress has an enormous amount of power over the military by Constitution and by law. And thus, the president doesn't always get his way in military affairs, nor does the Congress. It has to be compromised. Well, this permits the military to, as they have a consistent and comprehensive relationship with the Congress, they're testifying all the time on the Hill over this or that. If you look at the budgets and you look at the authorizations in the Congress, these are hundreds of pages of things, all the way over whether to reconstitute the deteriorating housing on Fort Bragg, all the way up to how many nuclear weapons to buy, and do we want to buy more F-22s or more F-35s, and how many ships should we build, and what kind of ships should we build. So there's all of this going on at the same time, and even though the Department of Defense has, 30 or 40 civilian appointees, presidential appointees, they're presiding over a group of 1.2 or 3 million people in active duty uniform, another 750,000 civilians, another 1+ million active reservists, active reservists and National Guards people. So they can't monitor this all the time, and there are many instances in which, although it's a lot better in the last 20 years, in which the military, in effect, goes over to the Congress and says, well, the Secretary of Defense has asked for this much money, but we really could use a little bit more, and wouldn't you like to have more ships built in your district, Congressman Taylor from Pascagoula, Mississippi, or more airplanes manufactured in Washington, Representative Dix. And this kinds of things goes on all the time. And then, of course, the Congress has an interest in that, and the Congress has forced the Air Force to buy more C-130Js that are manufactured down in Georgia than anybody wants except the manufacturer and the congressman. And this kind of log rolling has gone on a very long time. So there's a long tradition of this. It goes back at least, I would say deep into the 19th century. Where do you put your military bases, posts, etc.? Navy yards, Air Corps, Air Force bases. Don't ask, don't tell was a perfect example of it. Mr. Clinton wanted to do it in 1992-93. He said he was going to do it. The military rose in open revolt. There was a lot of loose talk, inappropriate talk. And they went to the Congress, and the Congress, there were some powerful people in Congress who wanted to teach this new Arkansas governor a lesson of how things worked in Washington, and they passed some legislation, and they essentially blocked him. And that's the kind of thing that goes on occasionally. And Mr. Obama knows this perfectly well. If you want to look at how he's played the game, he got Don't Ask, Don't Tell repealed, not right away, but after 2 years, after some senior military people had studied it and come out in favor of repealing it. The same went for the nuclear arms control treaty with the Russians and both of those things were passed in late 2010 in a lame duck session of the Congress, the equivalent of the dead of night, when the Republicans who would oppose these things were absolutely dazzled by the threat of the repeal of the Bush tax cuts. These are complicated kinds of things, and he just kind of slipped them through. I mean, it was very adeptly done. But he understands how that he negotiates with his military. That's not the way people think civilian control works in this country. But it is, and leading the military requires not just negotiation, but an understanding of military affairs and a moderate set of policies. You can't just force these institutions into line because they have their partisans, they have their constituencies, they have their stakeholders, and civil military relations in the United States is a group enterprise. All three branches of the government, including the courts, are involved.
So that kind of segues into our final question. In your talk, you mentioned how, especially under Chief Justice Rehnquist, he's kind of carved out this special legal status for the military. Could you elaborate what exactly you mean by that, why it's a dangerous precedent, and do you think it's likely to continue for the foreseeable future, or is there a way it can be reversed?
Well, here I rely on, I'm not a lawyer, I rely on the analysis of a professor of law in Florida by the name of Diane Mazur. And she, former Air Force officer, has studied and in a 100+ page essay in the Indiana Law Journal showed that from case after case, the Chief Justice brought along the court with him rulings which allowed the military to essentially exist in a separate legal category. You know, military people, uniformed people operate under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. And they were, under his rulings, allowed to maintain their own legal systems and their own precedents, even though over the last 50 or 60 years, there's been a convergence of military law, practice, and procedure, more with civilian kinds of changes in that same period, more rights for the accused, more appeals, etc. He has, in essence, in rulings, in opinions, argued that the military is a separate society. It's different and in many respects above American society in quality and discipline. It has a special role and function. And thus it's not to be tampered with by civilian courts. Although it's not exactly the same kind of thing, I can give you an example. I had an exchange with Justice Antonin Scalia some few years ago when I was teaching a course on constitutional law in the military for our scholars and graduate students. And I asked the justice, he was kind enough to come and talk to the group, asked the justice why in so many instances, almost all instances, did he believe that the Supreme Court should defer to the executive branch in national security under all these circumstances. He's a very histrionic sort of a fellow, and he said, well, I don't know anything about the military. We courts, we don't know anything about national security. We have to defer to the military and to the executive branch because they know, and they know what they're talking about. Not wanting to get into a knockdown drag-out with the justice, which I had once before when he visited UNC. I couldn't be too pressing. There were other people there wanting to ask questions. But my reaction was, wait a second. Judges don't know anything about anything. It's their job to listen to the arguments back and forth, to do the research, and then make a ruling. This is no different than any other area of national life, and we are finding out now, today, with the issues over civilian surveillance by the National Security Agency and the seeming invasion of civil liberties and privacy by the government that has been agreed to hundreds of times by a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts, that are not subject to review, that are not even subject to being known, that here the courts have set up a separate legal system in this whole area of civil liberties and civil rights law that is not subject to the regular legal system. Under the same principles that Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justice Scalia and some other justices have certified and continue to certify. It's not healthy, and it's not the way things should work in this country. There is a need for secrecy, but the courts, both particularly federal courts and state courts, have demonstrated that they can act in secret proceedings that are still subject to oversight, and that can be, that the procedures can be accomplished in ways that hew to our values and our laws and our procedures, and continue to claim, I think, the approval of the American people. So we tend to oscillate. The pendulum swings in these things. And in the so-called counterterrorism campaign, they've swung a little too far, in my judgment, in some ways. I'm not alone in that feeling, but it is contested territory.
Yeah. And on that somber note, we'll look to wrap things up.
Well,
Professor,
thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We very much enjoyed sitting down with you and hearing your thoughts.
Well, thank you, and I wish you all success with resuscitating the publication and getting the attention and teaching and informing the Carolina community.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching, and join us next month for a new interview.